there. Don't open that car.
For what? I'm about to head out.
Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see him.
This is my garage. I live here.
Caller says you don't match the resident. We got a possible intruder.
You're making a mistake. This is my property.
3 police officers thought they were responding to a routine, suspicious person call. They had a parking garage, a vague complaint from a nervous neighbor, and the swagger that comes from years of profiling without accountability. But when Jeffrey Watson, Scout Cox, and Patrick Gentry cornered Tony Valentine in his own residential garage at 9:15 p.m. and tried to detain him despite his protests, they unknowingly sealed their fates, harassing the very federal judge who had just sent their former police chief to prison. Before we continue, if you believe justice should apply equally to everyone, hit that subscribe button. Stories like these expose the truth, and your support keeps these critical narratives alive. The body cameras clipped to their vests captured everything, every illegal command, every dismissive sneer, every moment a decorated combat veteran was treated like a criminal in his own home. And unlike internal investigations that can be buried or conveniently stalled, the garage's private surveillance system recorded the entire encounter from multiple angles, backed up automatically to servers completely outside the department's reach, creating an ironclad record that would dismantle 3 careers and reshape how police approach residential confrontations. Tony Valentine's footsteps echoed through the concrete cavern of the parking garage, each step deliberate and unhurried. It was 9:15 p.m., and the federal judge had just finished reviewing case files in his 3rd-floor condo. His keys jangled softly in his right hand as he approached his black sedan, the same car he'd been parking in Space 3B for the past 4 years. He wore a gray hoodie against the November chill, jeans, and the kind of worn sneakers that spoke of a man who valued comfort over status. Above him, fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across the oil-stained floor. He never heard them approach. "Hey, stop right there. Don't open that car." The voice cut through the hollow silence like a knife, sharp and commanding. Tony's hand froze inches from the door handle. He turned slowly, his military training kicking in before his legal mind could catch up. 3 police officers stood 15 feet away, arranged in a loose triangle formation that any combat veteran would recognize as a tactical position. The one who'd spoken, a broad-shouldered white officer with a crew cut, had his hand resting on his duty belt. His nameplate read Watson. "Can I help you, officers?" Tony's voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used when addressing hostile witnesses from the bench. "We got a call about a suspicious person in this garage," Watson said, taking 2 steps closer. His partners, Cox and Gentry, fanned out slightly, their body cameras' red lights blinking in the dim light. "You live here?" "I do. 3rd floor, Unit 304. This is my vehicle." Tony gestured toward the sedan with his keys, the metal catching the fluorescent glow. Watson's eyes narrowed, scanning Tony from head to toe with the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with probable cause and everything to do with prejudgment. "You got ID?" "I'm standing at my own car in my own building's garage. What's the actual issue here?" "The issue," Officer Cox interjected, stepping forward with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, "is that you don't match the resident profile for this building. Now, we can do this easy or we can do this hard." Tony felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, that suffocating awareness that his law degree, his federal appointment, his 20 years of military service meant absolutely nothing in this moment. To these 3 men, he was just another black man in a hoodie who couldn't possibly belong in an upscale residential building. The irony wasn't lost on him. Watson wore the uniform of the very department whose former chief was currently serving 18 months in federal prison, a sentence Tony himself had handed down just 4 months ago from his courtroom bench. But these officers didn't know that yet. "Gentlemen," Tony said quietly, "you're making a mistake." Watson's hand moved to his holster. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can just walk away." Officer Jeffrey Watson had made a career out of reading people, or so he told himself. 15 years on the force had taught him to spot troublemakers, liars, and threats. And the man standing before him in the shadowy garage, refusing to immediately comply, refusing to show fear, that registered as a threat. Watson couldn't articulate why, couldn't point to any specific action or word that justified the adrenaline now coursing through his veins, but his gut told him this situation needed controlling. And Jeffrey Watson always trusted his gut. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Watson said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register cops use when they've decided cooperation time is over. "Show me some ID right now." Tony Valentine didn't move. His hands remained visible, his posture relaxed but ready, a stance perfected during 2 tours in Afghanistan, where reading aggression could mean the difference between life and death. He recognized what was happening here. Watson wasn't looking for compliance, he was looking for dominance. The moment Tony reached for his wallet, Watson would interpret the movement as threatening. The moment he argued, Watson would call it resisting. There was no right answer in this equation, no combination of words that would de-escalate a situation Watson had already decided needed escalating. "My name is Tony Valentine. I'm a resident of this building. I'm a federal judge for the Central District, and I'm telling you right now that you're violating my Fourth Amendment rights." Tony's voice never rose, never wavered. Each word was measured, deliberate, the kind of precision that came from years on the bench. Watson's face flushed red. "You think you're smart? You think throwing around big words is going to help you?" He took another step forward, closing the distance to less than 6 feet. "I don't care if you're the President of the United States. You're in this garage without authorization. You match a description we received, and you're refusing to comply with a lawful order." "What description?" Tony asked. "What exactly did this anonymous caller say that gives you reasonable suspicion to detain me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Officer Cox shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to his radio. Officer Gentry, the youngest of the 3, looked between Watson and Valentine with growing unease. But Watson had gone too far to back down now. In his mind, Valentine's calm demeanor wasn't the response of an innocent man explaining a misunderstanding. It was the calculated defiance of someone who thought he was above the law. "Your composure," Watson said, jabbing a finger toward Tony's chest without making contact. "That's exactly what guilty people do. They rehearse. They stay calm because they've practiced their lies." Tony's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "So innocent people are supposed to panic? Is that your standard for lawful behavior?" If you believe that a man's home should be his sanctuary, hit subscribe. Only those who support harassment will scroll past. Watson's hand dropped to his handcuffs. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're being detained for investigation." Investigation of what crime? Trespassing and obstruction. Watson's voice had gone cold, final. "Last chance. Turn around or we'll turn you around." To understand how 3 police officers could be so catastrophically wrong, you have to understand the department they came from. The Metropolitan Police Department had been hemorrhaging credibility for the better part of 2 years, ever since their chief, Marcus Reeves, was indicted on 14 counts of corruption, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Chief Reeves had run the department like a personal fiefdom, protecting officers who brutalized suspects, falsified reports, and operated with the kind of impunity that turns law enforcement into organized intimidation. When federal judge Tony Valentine sentenced Reeves to 18 months in federal prison, the department fractured. Half the force quietly welcomed the accountability. The other half saw it as a betrayal, an outsider attacking their brotherhood. Jeffrey Watson, Scout Cox, and Patrick Gentry belonged firmly to the latter camp. Watson's personnel file read like a road map of escalating aggression wrapped in the language of officer safety. 17 use-of-force incidents in 15 years, each one deemed justified by internal review boards that Reeves had carefully stacked with loyalists. 3 excessive force complaints from civilians, all dismissed without investigation. Watson had learned early that aggression was rewarded in Reeves' department, that dominance was mistaken for effective policing, and that the badge granted him immunity from the consequences ordinary citizens faced for the same behavior. Scout Cox was Watson's eager apprentice, a 7-year veteran who'd adopted his mentor's worldview wholesale. Cox had been present for 8 of Watson's use-of-force incidents, corroborating every report, backing every story. His own file showed a pattern of escalating encounters that could have been resolved with conversation, but instead ended with handcuffs, arrests for disorderly conduct that prosecutors later dropped, and a growing list of complaints the department had buried under procedural technicalities. Patrick Gentry was different, younger, only 3 years on the force. His file was thinner, his history less violent, but he'd made a critical mistake. He'd chosen Watson as his field training officer. In those crucial early months when a rookie learns what kind of cop he'll become, Gentry had absorbed Watson's lessons like gospel. Respect is weakness. Hesitation gets you killed. The streets don't respect nice guys. Dominance first, questions later. The three of them had become a unit, working the same shift, taking the same calls, reinforcing each other's worst instincts. And when Chief Reeves went down, when the federal hammer fell on their mentor and protector, they didn't see it as justice. They saw it as war. The judge who'd sent Reeves away became a symbol of everything they hated. Outside interference, federal overreach, the idea that they could be held accountable for doing their jobs. None of them had ever seen Judge Valentine's face. They'd only heard his name in the precinct locker room spat out like a curse. The establishment judge, the one who didn't understand what cops dealt with, the one who thought he was better than them. And now, in a dimly lit parking garage, they were face to face with their symbol, their enemy, their scapegoat. They just didn't know it yet. Tony Valentine's voice cut through the tension one final time, steady and clear as a bell. You should stop, right now, before this becomes something none of us can walk back from. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was the same tone he'd used countless times from the bench when warning attorneys they were about to cross a line that would cost their clients dearly. It was the voice of someone who could see the cliff's edge that others were sprinting toward blindly. But Watson heard only defiance. "Grab him," Watson ordered.
Officer Gentry moved first, motivated by that dangerous combination of inexperience and misplaced loyalty. His hands seized Tony's right arm with unnecessary force, wrenching it backward. Tony didn't resist. His military training had taught him that resistance against multiple armed opponents was suicide, and his legal training told him that every second of this unlawful detention was being recorded on 3 body cameras that would eventually seal these officers' fates. Cox grabbed the left arm, and together they forced Tony face first against the cold metal of his own car. The keys fell from his hand, clattering to the concrete with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Tony's cheek pressed against the sedan's hood, and he felt the familiar bite of steel handcuffs closing around his wrists with excessive tightness. "You're making a mistake," Tony said again, his voice slightly strained from the pressure on his chest. "I'm a sitting federal judge. I have judicial immunity. This is unlawful detention and false imprisonment." Watson leaned in close, his breath hot against Tony's ear. "Sure you are, and I'm the Attorney General. You can tell your stories down at the station." The handcuffs clicked tighter. Tony felt the metal bite into his skin, felt the familiar weight of humiliation that came with being reduced to a suspect, a threat, a problem to be contained. He'd worn the uniform of his country with pride. He'd earned a law degree while working 2 jobs. He'd been appointed to the federal bench by the President of the United States, and in this moment, none of it mattered. He was just another black man in a hoodie who'd committed the crime of existing in a space where someone didn't think he belonged. Gentry patted him down with rough, invasive hands, checking pockets, waistband, ankles. The search turned up exactly what Tony had said it would: a wallet containing his judicial identification, his driver's license showing this building's address, and a key fob to the vehicle they had him pressed against. Cox pulled the wallet free, flipped it open. His face went slack for just a moment as he stared at the federal credentials, the judicial seal embossed in gold. Then he closed it quickly, as if shutting the wallet could somehow shut away the reality of what they'd just done. "He's got fake ID," Cox announced, his voice too loud, too insistent. "Federal judge credentials, probably bought 'em online." Watson grabbed Tony's arm. "Let's go. You can explain your forgery charge to the desk sergeant."
They pulled Tony away from his car, away from his home, into a nightmare that was only beginning. The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan Police Department's main precinct blazed with institutional brightness as Watson, Cox, and Gentry marched their prisoner through the rear entrance at 10:47 p.m. They moved with the casual confidence of men who'd made 100 such walks before, guiding a handcuffed suspect through the booking area toward processing. Watson had even started mentally drafting his report. Suspicious person, refused to comply, fake credentials, transported without incident. The booking area buzzed with its usual late-night energy. 2 drunken, disorderly suspects slumped on a bench. A domestic violence call was being processed at Station 3. Officer Melissa Chen was arguing with a belligerent shoplifter who insisted the entire arrest was a setup. Normal Thursday night chaos. Then Watson walked Tony Valentine through the door. The change was instantaneous and absolute. Officer Chen's voice died mid-sentence. The desk sergeant, a 30-year veteran named Carl Morrison, looked up from his paperwork and froze, his pen suspended in mid-air. A detective walking past with coffee stopped so abruptly that the liquid sloshed over the rim of his cup, burning his hand. He didn't seem to notice. The silence spread like a shockwave. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. Even the shoplifter went quiet, sensing that something seismic had just occurred, but not understanding what. Sergeant Morrison rose slowly from his chair, his face draining of color so quickly he looked like he might faint. "Watson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what the hell have you done?" Watson's confident stride faltered. He looked around the suddenly silent room, seeing recognition and horror dawning on face after face. Officers who'd been lounging against desks now stood at attention, staring not at Watson, but at the man in handcuffs beside him. "We brought in a trespasser," Watson said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "He was in a residential garage, refused to show proper ID, had fake federal credentials. That's Judge Valentine. That's Federal Judge Anthony Valentine. You brought in a sitting federal judge in handcuffs?" The words hit Watson like a physical blow. Cox made a small choking sound. Gentry took an involuntary step backward, as if distance might somehow undo what they'd done. Tony Valentine stood perfectly still, his face impassive despite the too tight handcuffs cutting into his wrists. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence in the room spoke volumes that his words couldn't improve upon. Sergeant Morrison came around the desk, moving faster than his bulk suggested possible. "Get those cuffs off him right now! Right now!" His hands shook as he fumbled for his own handcuff key. "Judge Valentine, I am so deeply sorry. This shouldn't have—"
"The cuffs can stay on until my attorney arrives," Tony said quietly, his first words since entering the station. "I want everything documented exactly as it happened. No courtesy removals, no walking anything back. We're going to do this by the book." Watson's world tilted sideways. The judge who sent Chief Reeves to prison. The same judge. They'd just arrested the same judge. The Metropolitan Police Department's damage control machine activated within minutes of Tony Valentine's release. By midnight, the chief of police, Reeves' interim replacement, had called Tony's personal cell phone 3 times. By 1 a.m., the mayor's office had sent an emissary to Tony's condo with profuse apologies and assurances that the officers would face appropriate disciplinary action. By morning, the department's public relations team had prepared a statement describing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding that would be handled through internal review processes. Tony Valentine ignored every call, refused every visitor, and declined every offer to handle the matter quietly. Instead, at 9 a.m. on Friday morning, he walked into the federal building where he'd presided over hundreds of cases and headed not to his courtroom, but to the office of the United States Attorney. He carried a leather folder containing his personal account of the incident, copies of his medical documentation showing bruising and lacerations from the handcuffs, screenshots from his building security footage, and a formal request that the Department of Justice open an immediate civil rights investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The U.S. Attorney, Patricia Mendoza, had worked with Judge Valentine for 6 years. She'd never seen him angry. Even during the Chief Reeves trial, even when the evidence revealed depths of corruption that had shocked the entire legal community, Valentine had remained judicial, measured, controlled. But the man sitting across from her desk now radiated a cold fury that had nothing to do with personal vendetta and everything to do with principle. "They arrested me because I was trespassing," Tony said, sliding the folder across Mendoza's desk. "They arrested me because I was black in a place they decided I didn't belong. They ignored my explanation. They dismissed my identification as fake. They violated clearly established constitutional rights, and they did it with the confidence of men who'd never faced consequences." Mendoza opened the folder, her expression darkening as she reviewed the documentation. The body camera footage, all 3 perspectives, showed officers who weren't conducting an investigation. They were executing a predetermined conclusion. "If this happened to me," Tony said, "a federal judge with resources, connections, and knowledge of the system, what happens to the single mother who can't afford an attorney? What happens to the teenager who doesn't know his rights? What happens to the veteran?"
Who can't articulate the law being violated against him? He leaned forward. This doesn't get buried in an internal review. This doesn't get settled with sensitivity training. This goes federal and it goes public. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only manipulators and trolls want to see the law applied unevenly. Mendoza closed the folder, her decision already made. "I'll have the FBI's Civil Rights Division begin their investigation today. Full scope. Employment records, complaint histories, training documents, body camera footage from all 3 officers' entire careers." "Good," Tony said, "because Watson, Cox, and Gentry aren't anomalies. They're symptoms, and symptoms require systemic treatment." Within 72 hours, federal subpoenas landed at the Metropolitan Police Department, demanding personnel files, use of force reports, and internal communications. The department's attempt to handle this quietly had failed spectacularly. The federal hammer had fallen, and there was no internal review board that could stop it. The federal civil rights trial lasted 11 days, but the verdict took the jury only 4 hours to reach. Judge Rebecca Thornton, Tony Valentine's colleague and the jurist assigned to hear the case to avoid any conflict of interest, read the decision in a courtroom packed with media, civil rights advocates, and off-duty police officers whose presence spoke volumes about the department's fractured soul. The court finds that officers Jeffrey Watson, Scout Cox, and Patrick Gentry acted with malice and racial animus when they detained Judge Anthony Valentine on November 14th, Judge Thornton read, her voice steady and unforgiving. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of constitutional violations rooted not in legitimate law enforcement objectives, but in discriminatory assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces based solely on race. Watson sat stone-faced at the defense table, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge. Cox stared at the floor. Gentry, the youngest, had tears streaming down his face, whether from shame or self-pity was unclear. The federal charges came swift and severe. All 3 officers were indicted for deprivation of rights under color of law, a felony carrying up to 10 years in prison. False imprisonment charges followed. The civil suit, handled separately, would eventually cost the city $2.3 million in damages, the largest settlement in the department's history for a single incident. But the criminal convictions delivered the most devastating blow. Watson received 32 months in federal prison. Cox got 28 months. Gentry, granted slight leniency due to his junior status and cooperation during the investigation, received 18 months. the exact sentence Tony Valentine had given their former chief. The Metropolitan Police Department terminated all 3 officers immediately, a rare unanimous decision by the Civilian Oversight Board. Their names were added to the National
Decertification Index, ensuring they could never work in law enforcement again in any jurisdiction. Their pensions, built over years of service, were forfeited under the department's felony conviction clause. If you can't stand people who use their power to step on others, comment, "Everyone deserves respect." In the civil proceedings, depositions revealed what everyone suspected, but the body cameras had captured definitively. Watson had seen a black man in an upscale garage and made an assumption. Everything that followed, the aggressive approach, the dismissal of credentials, the escalation to arrest, flowed from that single moment of bias. The reasonable suspicion they'd claimed never existed. The anonymous complaint they'd referenced was fabricated. They had profiled, detained, and arrested a man for the crime of existing while black in his own home. Justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had finally arrived. Tony Valentine returned to the federal bench 6 months after the incident, walking through the same courthouse doors he'd entered for 15 years. But something fundamental had shifted. The case that had begun in a parking garage had become Valentine v. Watson, a landmark precedent cited in civil rights litigation across the country. Law schools added it to their curricula. Police academies used the body camera footage as a training tool on what not to do. The case became shorthand for the consequences of racial profiling wrapped in the illusion of lawful authority. Tony used the $2.3 million settlement to establish the Valentine Legal Defense Fund, providing free representation to victims of police misconduct who lacked the resources or platform to fight back. The first case the fund took on involved a 17-year-old kid detained in his own backyard. The second involved a grandmother arrested for trespassing while gardening at her daughter's house. The stories were depressingly familiar, variations on the same theme that had played out in Tony's garage. But the fund did more than litigate individual cases. It pushed for systemic reform, mandatory implicit bias training, stricter oversight of use of force incidents, civilian review boards with actual enforcement power, and body camera policies that made footage available to defendants within 72 hours of an incident. Some departments resisted. Others, watching officers get criminally convicted for constitutional violations, quietly implemented the changes. Tony never spoke publicly about the night in the garage, beyond his courtroom testimony. He didn't give interviews, didn't write opinion pieces, didn't turn his trauma into a brand. He simply returned to work, presiding over cases with the same measured fairness that had defined his career. But everyone who entered his courtroom knew his story. Defense attorneys knew it, prosecutors knew it, and police officers who took the stand knew that the judge looking down at them understood exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of a badge wielded as a weapon. The law, Tony had always believed, belonged to the people, not to those who enforced it, not to those who interpreted it, but to the citizens it was designed to protect. His case proved that when documentation met determination, even federal judges could hold power accountable. Even decorated veterans could be vindicated. Even 3 officers who thought they were untouchable could face consequences. Documentation is the only thing that brings down the untouchable. Do you think these officers got what they deserved, or was the system still too light on them? Subscribe for more stories of truth, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video to keep the light on injustice. The garage cameras never stopped recording. The body cameras captured every word. And justice, delayed but not denied, finally arrived.